Welcome to the Couples Expert Podcast with Stuart Fensterheim, LCSW, your source for the latest tips and practical down-to-earth advice on creating emotionally connected, thriving relationships. Now, here's Stuart.
Hi there, and welcome to the Couples Expert Relationship Podcast. You've reached Stuart Fensterheim, the Couples Expert. Today, I'm going to have on my show someone I'm very excited to talk with, because she does something that I believe is one of the up-and-coming areas that all of us in the relationship field need to be paying attention to. And these are the executives who travel a great deal, have families, and I think for the most part, for the longest time, even the people of us in the couples relationship field haven't paid close enough attention to the struggles and the difficulties that have come from having a relationship where one or both of the partners travel a great deal. Who I have on my show is Megan Bierce. Megan is a therapist out of Minnesota, and I love Minnesota accents. I've been out there a few times, and this is definitely the time of year that I like talking with people from Minnesota, because they are the ones that I love to throw out when it's January and February, that I'm in Phoenix, Arizona, Scottsdale, and it is 80 degrees, and I say, and by the way, what's the temperature there? And they pretty much almost routinely in January and February say, well, it's minus 50 degrees. And I said, well, I just got done sunbathing and swimming in my pool. How about that? And I love just teasing them, because this is why we live where we live. We live in Arizona because of the weather all year round, pretty much. We don't talk about the summers, but we love this time of year because this is why we live here. I first heard of Megan about her book that she has written on supercommuters, and we'll talk a lot about supercommuters and what basically that is. They are the couples that work so hard to stay together, even when their job keeps them apart. And one of the things that I learned about Megan just recently is that she actually has been living that life, and that she is a licensed therapist, and she's got about 13 years of experience of providing support and assistance to supercommuters. Her area of expertise is working with supercommuters, supermoms, and gifted girls. She's also the author of a book on supercommuter couples, staying together when the job keeps you apart. And she's also won, which is pretty cool, a Midwest Book Awards silver medalist on that book. She's been on lots of different talk shows talking about this topic. It's a really interesting area that she's been interviewed both on the BBC, the Today Show, CBS Evening News, Huffington Post Live, Forbes, you name it, U.S. News and World Report. So I feel really fortunate that she has been willing to share her time and her gift of talking about this incredible, important topic and helping families that have this really difficult separation during their marriage. So I really welcome you, Megan, to the Couples Expert Podcast, and I'm excited to have you here.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be a part of it.
Yeah, it's really fun because you and I had a conversation a little while back about our topic today being supercommuters, and that is one of your specialties. And more, I am seeing couples who are contacting me who are having that struggle of how do you maintain that relationship. But before we get into all of that, one of the things that I would like to know is a little bit about what led you to the path of being a therapist, and particularly the population of couples who are traveling quite a bit.
Sure. Like a lot of therapists, I think, I originally was not a therapist. I went to school and was an accountant. I became a CPA after my undergrad and found that I just was miserable in the position, but I was an auditor. And what I did like was the fact that I got to go into typically a lot of small family-run businesses were my clients. And I like the dynamic of, the office, which can be a lot like a family, and eventually became more of a supervisor role, both there and when I went into private accounting. And, people would joke that my office was a therapy office. My workers would come to me and talk about everything, their problems, their family, their relationships. And actually, even as I think back, when I was in high school, my nickname was Dr. Ruth. So somewhere in there was always, I know, right? There was always this kind of leaning towards somebody that other people could come to and trust and give their feedback. And so after 5 years of being a CPA, I just could not do it anymore. And I just started talking to people to figure out, what their jobs were and what did they like. And I took some personality tests, and writer, therapist, teacher were the ones that all came up. And it just so happens that my 2 mother-in-laws and father-in-law are all therapists. They're social workers and psychologists. And so I really got lucky to be able to talk to them firsthand about, why did you go in this profession and what is it that you like about it? And eventually, obviously, went to grad school and became a licensed marriage and family therapist and went into private practice. And originally in California, which you probably know as well, you really have to kind of specialize. It's really advised to find a niche to kind of set yourself apart. And mine initially was working with women and girls, in particular around perfectionism and high achieving kind of type A personalities. But then fast forward quite a few years, we unexpectedly moved to Minneapolis, which is originally where I'm from. And after about a year of being here, my husband was offered his dream job. But unfortunately, the job was in New York City. And like I mentioned, we're in Minneapolis, and it was 2010. We weren't sure how stable anything was. We had just bought a house and, of course, couldn't turn around and sell it. So we kind of made the best of the situation. And he spoke with some people also in the advertising industry who were doing this thing. They called it a super commute, where you actually live in one city and commute quite a distance to your job. And so we decided to give it a shot for a year. And around the same time, I was having more clients come into my practice, maybe not because of the commuter relationship, but it would come out in the sessions that some of their relationship stress was the fact that their partner traveled a lot for work, or they were on the road 2 or 3 days a week, or actually, as often happens, which you probably can attest to, is the commute stops or the trouble happens when their partner is actually at home. And so it felt like this is kind of where I need to be, that there's people out here struggling with this and nobody is really talking about it.
When you say the commute stops and the trouble starts at home, can you clarify that a little bit?
Sure. So I call it the reentry period. I don't know if there's an official term for it. So that could be like, in our case, my husband leaves on Monday and comes back on Friday. So the reentry time for us is Saturday and Sunday when he's back in the family. For some people, let's say they're a consultant and for a year and a half, they're flying between Chicago and Omaha, and then maybe they're done and it's a month or 2 before they're assigned to their next client. So all of a sudden they've been living basically apart for the most part for a year and a half. And now all of a sudden they're back together, every day, and the kids have gotten older and routines have changed and the person at home has their system down. And sometimes it's difficult to have that person kind of reintegrate full time into the family.
That makes so much sense, because one of the things that I see quite a bit in my office as well are those couples, and then the problems that begin have to do with, am I an outsider? Am I part of the family?
Right.
And that concept is so painful to the person that's commuting, because they feel so very much alone, and all they've been looking forward to is being back with their family.
Mm-hmm.
What advice do you typically give couples like that, how to then reintegrate that person?
Well, I think it's the first and most important thing to realize is that what works is probably going to change, maybe from month to month or year to year. So you need to be really open with the flexibility. So there's really kind of 3 main parts I found with the people that I interviewed for the book. And the ones that were the most successful navigated the reentry period. And so what they did is they made sure to talk about, like, for example, the commuter, when they return home, do they want their family to, run to the door and shower them with hugs and kisses? Or are they exhausted from traveling and just want 15 minutes to go read a magazine or just unpack? That's kind of the first step. Like, how do you want to initially return into the family? And kind of hand in hand with that is the second thing. It's communication. You really need to talk about that. And so for the person who's been at home, especially if you have kids, do they need to let go the very next day and hang out with their friends or get a massage? Like, how do they want to come back together? And then the third part that the successful couples really got good at was what I call building their village or asking for help, which I think in our society is really difficult to do. But the couples who did, or at least had that network in place for when stuff did happen, were the most resourceful.
So these were couples who knew what their limitations were. Exactly. And knew that they wanted, and then I would assume that goes both ways, both Yep. the commuter asking for help in their emotional needs right. and the person who's there asking for help to not feel like they have to drop everything and their world just stops.
Right. And there's little examples too, which again, having worked with couples, I think you've probably heard this one before. And again, this could go, either way, but one partner, let's say, is like, you never help me. You're finally home. Can you help me unload the dishwasher or load the dishwasher? It's usually the loading that's causing the problem.
right.
And they say, sure, happy to. And they start to load the dishwasher and the partner goes, no, it's supposed to be the glasses on the top rack. So it's like, can you get comfortable actually accepting the help and letting them do it in a way that works for them instead of micromanaging? Because then it starts that dynamic of, well, why should I help you? Because it's not good enough, or it's not done the right way, or, those little things that actually turn into a lot of bigger things later on.
And then when we talk about cycles in a relationship, and as an emotionally focused therapist, I focus a great deal on that, yes. having to do with the dishes issue that you just raised. I can't imagine a bigger trigger that could happen for couples to have someone say that, and mm-hmm. then what goes on with the partner. And are they able to share that vulnerable feeling? And how do I do that and not feel like, okay, here I'm back and now all we're going to do is fight?
Fight, exactly. And another thing I heard too, because I interviewed quite a few military couples. Mm-hmm. And so they obviously, when there's deployment and workshops, are separated for longer periods of time. And they would also say when they were having trouble, they would find that they actually would fight when they first got back together, and then they would fight the last few days that they were together before the person left again. The whole idea that it's easier to leave if you're mad than if you're intimate and attached and all that. So that was an interesting thing that came up in my interviews.
That's really interesting because I actually have a couple that I see now, and he's an ex-Navy SEAL. And that experience that they had every time he would go away was exactly that, where they mm-hmm. would have these big fights. Yep. And I think they've recognized that some of that is because it's so hard to leave.
Yep.
And then how do you then deal with the issues of feeling so lonely and alone in a marriage when you're not physically present? That's such a horrible sort of experience. How do you help people really bring each other with them, for lack of a better word,
right.
staying really together emotionally, even when they're not physically together?
Well, again, I think that comes down to the communication, because you need to figure out kind of what personality type you are. Like, are you a verbal? Are you an auditory? So, some couples might do great on the phone or with Skype or with letters. So I think you need to get creative, first of all, for sure. But I think technology has made this so much easier. So can you stick a note in their suitcase before they go? Can you have a set time to just have a quick text exchange? A lot of couples had either monthly or more frequently date nights. Mm-hmm. A lot of them did staycations, which is another kind of newer term, where instead of right. going on a vacation, you just go stay at a hotel in your city or someplace close by. So you're not spending the time and money actually on the travel, but you can get away from your kids or, your obligations and have a dinner and actually have quality time together. And that, again, is a really big piece. It's quality, not quantity. So you really have to maximize your time together. So I have a bunch more, but if you have more questions, then I'll take a break there.
What about the trust issues? And I think that's a huge one for a lot of couples that aren't real secure in the relationship, which is why that's so critical for these kind of couples. Right. How do you help people with those fears and doubts and feeling really unimportant at times and wondering, is a partner really there?
Right. Well, I think that comes down to how do you communicate and how do you vocalize that and how do you show that for each other? And people always say, oh, aren't these relationships more at risk for infidelity? And I would say no. I don't know how you feel about that, but I think there's probably as many people who have affairs that, have a 10-minute commute as cross country. Mm-hmm. I think one thing I talk about it with this type of relationship, there's a lot of ambiguous loss, which is a term for when there is emotional connection but physical absence. And so a lot of the work is around that. Like, what is your identity when they're home and when they're not home? Can you find meaning? Can you because I think a lot of that loneliness is how do you connect with your spouse and how do you connect in the greater world? So if all of your focus and all of your being is tied up in one person being physically there all the time, I think you're going to run into trouble regardless of the commute. So how do you build each other up together and apart?
Yeah, it's sort of the quality versus quantity question.
Yeah.
And the other thing that I think for someone who I used to have a job there, I did some traveling, is, people think when you're traveling, it really is sort of all this excitement and that you have all this time to sort of, if you talk about the infidelity issue, but the amount of intensity of meetings and the kinds of things, you have actually less time to do than if you were here at home, as you were saying.
Exactly. And I think, too, one thing I talk about, too, is how to decide if a super commute situation is right for you as a couple. And I have a whole bunch of questions for them to ask each other. And I found a theme in the people I've interviewed, too, is what was their attitude towards the situation? Is it one of like, okay, this is an opportunity for me or my spouse to eventually get promoted in a year? Like, is it a temporary thing or is it a permanent thing? With the military families, they're like, this is what we sign up for. When you marry somebody in the military, you're going to be separated. So I really think your attitude towards the situation makes a big difference, too. Can you find the benefits of the situation and make the most of it?
The sad part for me is I know, like with the military families in particular, there's really a network of other women. And I think about the super commuters, and I don't know if I've ever heard of anything where there's really a support network for the spouses.
No, and that's one thing that I had wanted to start when I initially embarked on this was, like a support group, and I called it the Weekday Widows. Mm-hmm. People didn't like the term, which I understand, but it was really to kind of be a place for these women who were alone but not really, and single but not, and kind of had the stressors of being a single parent but not really. And so again, it's kind of this ambiguous place, and I'm still trying to figure out how to connect those people, whether it's a private group or a Facebook group, or because what I hear the most is when people learn about the book or learn about my specialty, or even just learn that I'm in a commuter relationship, they're like, oh my gosh, I thought I was the only one who felt that way. Or, oh my goodness, I'm glad that, other people feel like this, because I think you and I were talking about this. Sometimes there's a lot of shame that goes along in these relationships because people who don't understand it fully have a lot of judgment around it. Like, how can you possibly love your spouse if they're gone every week? Or how is your husband a good parent if he's not there Monday through Friday? And so I think it shuts a lot of people down and they become really isolated.
Right. And the one that we were talking about, I recall on our telephone call, had to do with not showing up for kids' activities and the shame that comes with that. And how do you help kids understand that?
Yep. And again, there's a perfect example how sometimes in the right situation, technology can work. Do you have a smartphone that you can, FaceTime or Skype and actually have them in quotation marks at the game? That's kind of one way to,
No, just don't hit the computer.
Right, exactly.
No, that's an excellent point. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you when we look at this group of different people, and you talk military families, and now with the presidential election around the corner, I wonder a lot about politician families and how, the amount of traveling, or I was talking to a ball player the other day, and the number of games that they have, I think is 160 some games as a baseball player, where most of it, at least half is away. Yeah. How do you deal with really staying intimate? And I'm not talking sexually now. I'm talking emotionally intimate. How do you have those conversations? And if there's a challenge, how do you bring those up and how do you talk about them?
Well, I think some of it goes back to basic couples therapy is, can you use the I feel statements? Instead of starting off with, you never do this, or why don't you do that? I feel really alone if you tell me you're going to call and then you don't. Those sorts of, so kind of, I would talk with couples about that. Can you start at that very basic conversation. Sometimes it's really slow going.
Right. And I think some of that has to do with the security of the relationship.
Exactly.
And you're talking a lot about that and being vulnerable to really have an experience with your partner where you know that they matter more than anyone in the world.
Exactly. Tell them you love them. Send, is it a trinket? Is it, like I said, a little text? And again, technology and, there's Snapchat, like you can get creative with that too, obviously to keep it G-rated, but there's ways to stay connected. But I think, like you said, it's the emotional intimacy. Do you feel special and do they care about you? And when you're home, and I think this is an important one too, because I keep mentioning technologies, when you're home and when you are together, can you put your phones down for 2 or 3 hours and just connect with each other?
I'm laughing because did you hear there's now a new word?
No.
Called phubbing? Have you heard about that yet?
No.
You'll laugh at this one, but It fits right to what you're saying. Phubbing is phone snubbing. So that when you're in a conversation with someone and they're looking at their phone or they're doing that, they're calling that now phubbing. Phubbing. And it's an actual word they're thinking of putting in the dictionary.
Yeah, I can see that.
And it's really making each other feel important all the time, not just when you're together, but whenever.
Mm-hmm. And it can be a little check-in, like, even a voicemail or a phone call or a text, like, oh, I really loved sitting on the couch holding your hand this weekend, or thank you for taking such good care of our kids while I'm away, or thank you for working so hard and being on the road. I know it's really difficult. So kind of speaking gratitude, that comes down to gratitude too.
And it's really the small things, isn't it?
Yep, it totally is. Like my husband sometimes will leave just little notes for us on Monday morning before he goes to the airport. Nothing major, nothing elaborate, but just something really sweet from the weekend. And it's a great way to start the week instead of being, oh, I'm so sad he's gone. It's like, oh, what a great guy, or what a great weekend we had, or things like that.
How do you help kids in this to also feel that connection?
Again, I think it's about the quality versus quantity. But I learned a lot of great little tips from the military families. So they have what are called the Hug a Hero dolls. You can make a little stuffed doll that has the face of the parent who's away. You can insert a little video record or a voice recorder so they can even record the sound of the parent who's away. So those obviously are a little bit more tangible, but we would do things like a little journal during the week. So we would jot down, like on Monday, somebody lost a tooth, or on Tuesday, whatever little things happen during the week, because you don't always have the chance to talk with the commuter every day. And that way on the weekend, then they can go through the journal with the commuter and kind of recount the week, the little details that kind of fall through the cracks between the phone calls. Another thing my husband does sometimes is what's called photo postcards. So you take a picture with your smartphone and it turns it into a postcard. So he'll take pictures of things he sees during the week in New York, or if he's traveling elsewhere, and sends it to the kids. And it's super fun to get mail, and it's a way for them to kind of see where he's at. But the one that I really like too is, again, just really feeling emotionally connected and present, and put down the phones and things like that. And just, again, reminding the kids that you love them. Some other kind of tricks that the military families shared were something called a Hug a Hero doll, which is a little stuffed animal or doll that looks like the person who's away. There are voice recorder books where the person can record themselves reading a story. That's a big favorite in our household. So the kids can have their dad read them a book in quotation marks while he's away. And a nice one too, because depending on the age of the kid, time is a really hard concept to grasp. So one of the military family ideas was to take a jar and put kiss-shaped candies. We won't do any commercials here. And you put one in there for each day that the person is away. So the idea is that the child gets to eat a kiss candy, and so then they can visibly see the jar get more and more empty. And then when they eat the last one in there, their parent is going to be coming home the next day.
I love that idea. That sounds really, really great. And that also opens up the discussion. You could do something similar, couldn't you, for couples?
Yep, for sure. Yeah.
Maybe putting little love notes in a jar and having your partner pull one. My wife actually did that on an anniversary once. She put in a whole bunch of these things, and it really was something that and we were talking about the triggers, and even when you're triggered, you can pull something like that. It reminds you, particularly if you're away, I think you need that kind of reinforcement.
Yeah. Well, and I think a big thing that is kind of the flip side of the successful relationships are the ones that have trouble are the ones where resentment flares up a lot. And I think if you can kind of inoculate yourself against that with those sort of little notes, I think it's really important. So what I talk to clients about is, okay, you might get mad because a pipe bursts in the house and your kids are running around, and why is your spouse not here to help? Take a breath. Like, breathing is important, but then try to start listing all the things you're grateful for. Like, what does their job or the commute allow? Try to combat for. But resentment is in these sort of relationships.
Yeah, you need to just really do everything you can to avoid those resentments. Now, you mentioned your book a couple of times, and we haven't really talked about it. Could you share with my listeners a little bit about your book and where they can find it and all those kinds of things?
Yeah. So the book came out of my experience. A few months into the commute, I wanted to start blogging, and my husband's like, why don't you blog about us being commuters? And I was like, I don't know about that. But I sat down and started to write the blog, and it was 10 pages, which, as you may know, is kind of too long for a blog post. So
yeah, just a little bit.
A little bit long, more than 1,500 words. So I'm like, maybe I have a book here. And then again, like I said, with more clients coming in and just meeting more people in general who would say, oh, my uncle did that, or, oh, we used to do that. I was like, there's a lot of people. So I put the word out on social media and said, hey, if you know somebody that's done this or does it, can I interview them? And I had more people respond than I had space in the book to do. And so what I did is I interviewed all these people. I combined our experience, and then I also used some of the research from the Rudin Center out of NYU, that's the transportation department. And they have a study that came out about the emergence of supercommuters. So between all of that, it's stories from these people, like what their experiences are, what works, what doesn't work. And then I also have a section there dealing with that ambiguous loss that I mentioned. So that's kind of a nice chapter if therapists are working with these clients. And then in the end, I have, I think, 23 or 24 questions for couples, both who are considering a commute or maybe currently are in it and having some trouble, to kind of go through together or with a therapist if they choose, and really kind of make these relationships work. I mean, that's the subtitle, is staying together when a job keeps you apart. Because you can do it. There's a lot of successful relationships that live this way.
And that really is the message for all of us, isn't it? That if the two of you put your heads together and really love each other and are willing to be vulnerable with each other, you can accomplish whatever.
For sure. And to answer your second part, it's available wherever books are sold. It's in paperback and ebooks. So you can find it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, iTunes, brick and mortar stores.
And one of the things I'm going to do is I'm going to list in my show notes for today's podcast the name, the title of the book, and how to get hold of it, and all of those things, so you don't have to write it down. Especially if you're a commuter and you're driving right now, please don't. Please don't write it down. Please don't do that.
No, but I think it's something that's going to continue to rise. I mean, it's on the rise now, but I think it's just going to continue. So.
What were one of the, maybe one or two of the questions you think that people were surprised by in terms of what they hadn't thought about? Is there any ones in particular that stand out?
The questions that I ask them?
Or the questions they should ask themselves?
Oh, I have them answer the question, and this is, it's geared towards both of them actually, but it's, what is one of the things that causes you the most stress? Like task or, household chore or whatever. And can you either hire somebody to do that, or can you have your spouse help you with that? So that's part one. And the second part is the question, if you are going to let your spouse help you with it, can you let them do it in their own way?
Right. I think
that's kind of back to that, like, do you need to micromanage?
I think the other question that comes up a lot for me is when two people are not together, I think the issue of phone calls becomes such a big issue.
Yes.
And sometimes people are so busy, particularly when we talk about time zone differences and things like that. Do you have a recommendation for folks about the frequency of that and how to deal with when you can't talk? Because
no, I don't have a hard, fast rule, because, again, that's something that each couple needs to decide on their own, and they also have to be open to changing that. Again, depending. So, for example, the baseball player you brought up, or ball player, they may be able to call most nights at 6, but if it's game night, they probably can't. So do you skip it, or do you, set an alternative time to call? If you can't call, make sure you text and say, can't call, we'll try you in the morning. Again, I think you just have to amp up your level of communication, the frequency and the clarity of it. And again, another thing that people, I think, were surprised by kind of in the book is that people say, oh, shouldn't you talk to your kids every night at 6 o'clock or whatever? That is something that needs to kind of be renegotiated all the time too, because depending on the age of the kids, sometimes it's more difficult for them to be interrupted. it's kind of out of sight, out of mind, but not in a negative way. But they have the routine, and sometimes having the spouse interrupt during the week or during the middle of homework or whatever kind of is more difficult emotionally for them. But then you need to communicate so that the partner who's away isn't like, oh my gosh, my kids hate me. They don't,
right.
Have a conversation about that. Like, I couldn't talk to you tonight, Dad, because I was, whatever.
That comes up a lot during divorce situations. So it's a very similar issue, I think, particularly what it's like for both of them, the person who's away to hear the argument over the phone about your dad's on the phone. No, I don't want to talk to him. And what that feels like, that sometimes it is better not to do that.
Yeah. And it's interesting you brought that up about the divorce, because that's another trigger for, I find, some difficulty with the partners is they call it the Disney dad situation, which is a dynamic that typically happens in divorce cases. But it's when the commuter is home, they want it to be all about fun and games and, let's play. But the reality is there's homework to do, there's chores to do, there may be a huge to-do list that's piled up during the week. And so how do you navigate that and communicate that so that, again, the spouse at home isn't like, oh, great, so I have to do everything during the week and on the weekends too. So that's a common argument I hear.
And the flip side of that, I think, is also where, the partner who's at home doesn't necessarily want dad or mom to feel like they have to just come home and do everything. So they try to take it away from them.
Yep.
And maybe what they've been looking forward to more than anything is sitting down with their child and doing homework.
Right.
And I don't think people think about that because that's more the normalcy.
Right.
And without that, what does that feel like?
Yep.
And how to really not feel alone. Well, go ahead, Megan. I'm sorry.
Saying, I don't know if you hear about this at all from the couples that you see is, one of the reasons I feel for the rise in these commuter relationships is, a combination of the economy and the housing market. But I think there's a lot more dual income couples these days than there were 30 years ago. And if one spouse is starting to commute and the other one is working full time, at some point, sometimes they decide it's just too difficult. So they go to part-time or they stop. And so there's sometimes the grief and loss around their career and their connection with coworkers. And so there's like all these side issues that kind of go along with this potentially too, that make it more complex than appears on the surface.
It's a pretty fascinating topic, and I really want to just thank you for sharing it with my listeners and really giving of yourself and the time and really giving to a group of people that I think not many people have really focused on enough.
Yeah.
And one of the questions I guess I have for you in sort of closing is, what have you learned about yourself in this as you've been doing this? And is there something that you were surprised by within yourself?
I think just the idea that, we're doing it. We were really both kind of nervous because we said we'd do it for a year and it's been 5 now. And the first year was rough. I still remember this time where everybody was just so ready to be home. And because of the weather, he missed his flight and wasn't going to be able to be home. We had stuff planned. It was like both of us, like, oh my God, why are we doing this? But, when we sit down and list out the reasons why and the advantages to it, and we're like, we can make this work. And we're just as strong of a couple as we were when this started, maybe even more so, because we both know that we can be apart and still be together. The physical distance doesn't have to mean emotional distance. So I'm happy that we're one of the success stories so far, and hopefully that will help other people. And people always ask about the kids too, and I think our kids are doing really well. I mean, there's obviously days that they're sad their dad isn't here, but they know that he loves them, and when he's home, he's all about them. So it's been nice that it's continued to be that way.
And then you have something that you can stand back and look at yourself, look at your relationship and say, we really are pretty awesome.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean that in every sense of the word, that it allows you to really feel that love that we all need to not feel like we have an unstable relationship.
Right. I mean, people say, oh my God, what about infidelity? And don't you trust him? And I'm like, I do. Like, we just do, so.
And the feeling of together, we'll never be alone because we have each other.
Right.
Well, thank you again, Megan, for coming on and giving of yourself. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And, just wanted to remind all my listeners, I'll have information on Megan that if you want to get hold of her, how to do that and ask her any questions. And thank you again, and we'll see you guys next time. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to today's episode with your host, Stuart Fensterheim. You're one step closer to reigniting that fiery passion with your partner. For more information and your 30-minute free phone consultation with Stuart, visit www.thecouplesexpertscottsdale.com. We'll see you next time.